Welcome to FA Exclusive. I'm Atul Singh. I am in India today. With me is Glenn Call, and he is in the northeast of the US, not the northeast of India. He is in the Boston area, and together we'll make sense of the world for you. What has the world been up to in August? And our three top issues for this month are: do we get a wider Middle East war? That's number one. Number two, a new battle of Kursk. The Russia Ukraine war heats up. And number three, is the US debt a big problem? Without further ado, let's start with number one. Do we now get a wider Middle East war? Over to you, Glenn.
Well, good afternoon, I guess it is technically here, just a moment ago.
Oh, yes, it's good afternoon now.
I am on the three subjects this week. I am, I guess, relative to the conventional apprehensions and views, perhaps an optimist ever so slightly on two of them, or at least on one of them, and a more positive optimist on a second, and from my perspective, I guess, relative pessimist on the other. So the first one is the Middle East crisis and the risk of a wider Middle Eastern war, given the series of tit for tat missile launches, drone launches, assassinations, bombings, and so on between Israel and Iran, with the surrogates who are doing most of the work and suffering, Hezbollah and Hamas, also as part of the mix. And here, of the three topics, I am slightly a bit more optimistic. Sounds far too positive, but less alarmist than the conventional view. It is a truism, a conventional thing to say, also accurate, that each of these strokes, whether by Israel or Iran or Hezbollah or Hamas or the Houthis and so on, brings the protagonists in the Middle East ever closer to a regional war, which would involve most of the countries in the Middle East and probably the United States. But it's also true that it hasn't happened, and I think the assessment we should make of the current circumstances and the most recent actions, which is the assassination of the Hamas leader in Tehran and then of the Hezbollah leaders outside of Beirut, that the likelihood of this collapsing or deteriorating into the feared wider conflict is less probable than most people fear. I hope that is correct. Obviously, I think everyone would, except for perhaps the right of Iran and the right of Israel. But I think that is the case. So why? The relations between Iran and Israel have been pretty much a zero-sum game for decades, but each country realizes, in particular Iran, the leadership in Iran, that a wider war would be devastating, which possibly is acceptable if the net benefit to the protagonist outweighs the pain. And I can see, and I think that the Iranian leadership, being quite rational, can see no plausible scenario of a wider conflict that would provide a net benefit to Iran. The distance from Iran to Israel is at the border 1,200 kilometers, and from Tehran to Tel Aviv is about 1,800 kilometers, I think. Iran can strike Israel with rockets, drones, and so on. And I think that they have so many that if they launched a large number, some would get through the defenses of Israel, Israel's neighbors, the United States, and so on, and could probably cause substantial damage. But the Iranian leadership knows that that's the one direct way Iran can strike Israel. But the leadership knows that their military is substantially overmatched, and that the regime would suffer tremendous material damage, and probably its actual existence would gravely be endangered. The new prime minister has not yet solidified his cabinet or his control. The intelligence services of Iran and the military are at knives point with each other and in disarray after the assassination in Tehran and after various other failures and rivalries. Their capabilities, their support in Iran is very low. There's more concern by the leadership about internal stability and the ruthless measures that they have used and need to use to maintain it than would lend strong encouragement to an adventurous policy, a term from another era, against Israel. So the protagonists, those in favor of seeing a deterioration or the beginning of a wider war between Israel and Iran, really sit in the prime minister's office in Jerusalem and the far right of the Israeli political system, and some military circles. Now, to be balanced or fair, there are leaders, the younger ones in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is sort of the Praetorian Guard of the Iranian regime, who also would like a war. But the more senior officers, the more seasoned officers in both countries realize that the costs for each would be great and the benefits are hard to see. So what has happened? The normal the normal course of events in a diplomatic clash at the point of military action of this sort has played out, and once again, which is that theoretically Iran established its deterrence by having missiles, by issuing warnings, by using surrogates to its deterrence to protect its sovereignty and its freedom of action. Iran's deterrence has been shown to be ineffective. The assassinations occur in Iranian Revolutionary Guard protected guest houses in Tehran, and the large missile strike from
the ability of Mossad and Israeli security agencies to strike whoever they want, wherever they want in Iran since 2011 is staggering. Operationally, what they've achieved is absolutely brilliant. It's not something India could have achieved. It's not something, I dare say, even the CIA could have probably achieved, despite the large Iranian diaspora in the US, to blow up Ismail Haniyeh in his own bed in the Shah's former ski palace.
Well, this is
extraordinary.
Yeah, this is part of the reason the regime is wisely prudent or hesitant to initiate a larger conflict, because
very quickly, one of their ministers, I think the Minister for Intelligence or Security, a while ago said publicly that no one can sleep securely in Tehran at night. Oh, you probably know the details. I'm forgetting the character, Glenn. Please forgive me, and I ask forgiveness from our viewers. But that admission shows the extent of the Israeli penetration of a very porous Iranian state.
Well, not just the state, but the intelligence services, the IRGC, the power structure, the leadership on which the survival of the regime depends. And since that is so clearly the case, numbers of IRGC leaders since the guest house explosion have been detained and removed, and everyone fears everybody else, which is paralyzing. So
It
both sides
seems
miss.
the regime is going through its own version of Stalinist paranoia. Of course, it's Islamist. It's not Stalinism.
Except
And
this time there's cause. Stalin
yeah,
just invented things, and here the Israelis have, it appears, widely penetrated the Iranian structure, lending substantiation or credence to that, or to the causes of concern for the Iranian leadership, which would induce them to think twice and thrice about initiating a large-scale response and thus war. Is that after the explosion, after the assassination of, gosh, right now the gentleman's name slips my mind, but the
Ismail Haniyeh or
Hania, thank you,
Haniyeh. Yeah.
Hania in Tehran, there were large expressions of support for the assassination by the Iranian public, because, as we know, repeatedly the Iranian regime will massacre large numbers of its own people for expressing such outrageous demands as allowing a woman to wear perhaps a multicolored, headscarf instead of not. So they have a lot of concerns that are legitimate, real, that lead them to prudence. They can't achieve what they have threatened to achieve. And so the way to avoid humiliation and to try to move forward is to do exactly what they have done, which is they had their surrogate, Hezbollah, just launch another series of missiles, which were targeted at a military base very explicitly. The leadership of Hezbollah made clear that they were not seeking to harm any civilians, and that here's where we're going to attack. And that was
But
largely
they did
parried
hit
at the cost of.
children. They did hit Druze children in the
Did
Golan
they?
Heights, and they have made northern Israel unlivable. There are forest
Yeah.
fires.
Oh,
People are
it's
now
not a
living in
happy
hotels,
situation.
and so
Um,
Israelis view it as as an infringement of their sovereignty. They've
which it
effectively lost
is,
control of their territory.
but it's also a careful one, telegraphed in advance to indicate that we don't intend to go any further. And then, after which they declared victory, we have achieved our objectives and we intend no further strikes. And so both sides beat their breast, threaten the other, assert their masculinity and sovereignty, and then stand back. And truly,
Hmm.
I've said this many times in talks, which people think is facetious, and it does sound humorous, but it is true. We are mammals, and just like our relatives, the simian apes, a lot of this is for status and to establish dominance and deterrence without, or so as to avoid, actual lethal danger or acts. And it is a sensible way, and we think that we are being clever. In fact, we're just acting as mammals at the level of a state.
We are cleverer
So,
than lions who end up killing each other. So we are certainly cleverer.
well, I don't know. We're good at killing each other too. But this is why I have thought that bad as this is, with a substantial assist from the United States Sixth Fleet, 2 aircraft carriers, a number of guided missile cruisers cruising off the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the explicit, repeated warnings by the United States Biden administration to Iran that if you do anything, you will pay a price from us, which you would not recover from soon, has led to irrational actions, uh, although we remain at an ever closer brink to a wider war, because, as Atul and I have said, and as I think we all know a number of times, any one of these crises in the Middle East now or throughout history only takes an over ambitious or ill-judged lieutenant someplace to step 1 meter across one line or another, and then you
Uh,
cannot ever get back control. But
and
for
again,
now,
that
I think that
harks
we've avoided the worst.
and that harks back to human nature in history. I always there's a battle, so I always hark back to World War One. And Neil Ferguson says this is another Cold War. This is not like World War One. But I always go back to World War One because before World War One, no one really wanted war. The German and the British monarchies were relatives, and yet there was a period of escalation, one pinprick leading to another, leading to yet another, and so on and so forth, alliances forming. And eventually, Gavrilo Princip's shot, killing, of course, the Archduke, the Crown Prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, led to World War One. And part of it was because people thought it would all be over pretty quickly. The Napoleonic Wars were far in the past. The wars since 1815 to 1914 had largely been limited and largely been imperial wars in which you showed up with the Gatling gun to fight. Yeah, to fight people with spears. And so there were songs like "It's a Long," it'll be over by. They were not songs, I suppose, but everyone assumed it'll be over by Christmas. And then, of course, the songs changed. By the end of the war, it's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to home. And I see the situation in the Middle East as on a powder keg. We know Israelis have done major operations in West Bank. We know they are striking Hezbollah. They have been dealing with Hamas in Gaza. And so now suddenly, let's assume they go full throttle. And they might, because this is, if not now, when? Hezbollah is a pest. They have killed Fuad Shukr. They have superiority in armaments. They have an effective military force. They're already at war. They've lost the war of narratives in American campuses. And actually, to be honest, in the entire left, I'm in India right now, the entire left-leaning, remember, India is again a polarized country like the US, the entire left-leaning element in India, and not just left-leaning, many who are not left-leaning, who have memories of the freedom struggle, and people especially studying humanities in Delhi University, Ashoka University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, these elite universities, they are all pro-Palestinian. And so they've already lost the narrative war anyway, so why not have a bish-bash-bosh in right earnest?
Well, they can't win the narrative really because it's changed the dominant perception. The thumbnail sketches that there's an oppressed people in a de facto colonization situation from an aggressive Western nation, and on top of that, you have the the underlying anti-Semitism that is part of most Judeo-Christian civilizations, and so the Israelis are screwed, frankly, for that. The only thing,
well, they are popular. They are popular with the Hindu right that looks up to them tremendously.
And we should all take our lessons from the Brahmins, I guess.
Well, I mean, the Hindu right is headed by a lower caste chap from the oil pressing caste. So.
Everything has fallen apart. What can one do? But
so says a Boston Brahmin.
Your point. Well, I was going to talk about how history. What's the current conventional saying? Oh yeah, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Yeah.
It really is true. To the point where I have bored to death numerous relatives, which is why I have no relatives anymore, by my tales of family history and history.
You're stuck with me.
Yeah, I'm right near over that direction, about 5 kilometers, is where pretty much the first lethal act of a totally forgotten war called King Philip's War in American history, which is in 1675, the most lethal war in terms of population killed in
it was genocide, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a genocide. Yes. the way that war began, and this will be very brief, but just to make the point, was the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a man named Winslow, and the chief of the principal tribe was a man named with the name King Philip. It was forget his Indian name. And both of them were average men trying to avoid war, who felt honor bound to take certain steps that led to the destruction of an entire population. And it's the same sort of dynamic where for reasons of honor and perceived necessity, the views are short and narrow, and the disaster can come. So certainly this is absolutely a threat. I'm not sanguine, which is a bad word because sanguine can mean bloody and can mean unconcerned.
Sanguinary means bloody, of course, and sanguine means hopeful.
Yeah.
And you can make the transition from sanguine to sanguinary pretty quickly.
Yeah, which is always the case.
Actually, some people in the Middle East are sanguine about being sanguinary.
It's certainly strong advocates, which gets to the last point, I think, which is really substantial in this whole dynamic. And where is the most decisive point in how this will play out? What Iran will do? It's not Tehran. It's Jerusalem. It's the prime minister of Israel's office,
Benjamin Netanyahu.
because he
needs the war. He needs the war partly because that is the only thing keeping him in office. And he needs the war also partly because that's probably keeping him out of jail.
That's exactly it. He has personal incentive, which is grotesque, but apparently real for him, and personal conviction, and also he is beholden to the religious right in Israel, and so what
which he is, his government would fall. It's a proportional representation system with lots of small parties. The religious parties, the far-right parties have risen in importance because their populations have increased over time. They have more children. Yeah. And to stay in power, Bibi has had to sleep with the devil. And in the process, he's contracted STDs.
And so unless he continues to colonize the remaining Palestinian lands in the West Bank, and unless he continues his benighted objective of destroying Hamas utterly, neither of which is achieved. Well, taking all of the lands in the West Bank is achievable, but each of which guarantees endless conflict and pushes Iran ever further towards feeling obliged to take a step that it doesn't want. I'm no friend of Iran whatsoever, but the dynamic in the region is such that they are feeling compelled, for these mammalian reasons in part, by the actions of the Israeli far right, which is a lunatic circumstance. But that's I think truly where the decisive point is. If the U.S. and others, of course, can succeed in getting a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, Iran will not take a step that it doesn't want to take.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.